Hello. Now, imagine that someone has died and was buried according to his last rites in a graveyard where he is inside the grave. There is neither even an air nor other thing. And for 11 days, when he is taken out of the grave, we find out that he is still breathing. Yes, it's a very strange story from Brazil. And as I said, sometimes it's hard to believe in some things, but there are all the verified evidences about this story. Usually, a graveyard is far away from the population, but now the population of the world is increasing so fast. Many times, it happens that you have to remove the graveyard for households, but the population itself increases so much that it gets closer to the graveyard. Many new settlements are built. So in Brazil, there was a woman lived in Northeast. This woman's name was Rosangela Almeida dos Santos. So we will say Rosangela was about 37 years old. She was from a decent family. She was married. Her family was doing well, but she had no children. Rosangela was always complaining about dizziness and giddiness, so she would often get dizzy and take her medicine. But everything else was fine. She had no illness or problems. At the age of 37, in the third week of January, Rosangela gets dizzy again. Her health deteriorates a little. Her husband takes her to the hospital. She is admitted there. Now, her mother and sister are in the hospital to taking care of her. But then they come to know that while staying in the hospital, Rosangela had 2 heart attacks. Doctors were treating her. But during her treatment, finally, on January 28, 2023, suddenly, Rosangela dies because of the last stage of suffocation. As per the will of the family, the post-mortem was not done because there was already a patient who was ill. His treatment was already on record in the hospital. Rosangela's body brought home. After that, all the prayers and other things happened in church. Then on January 29th, according to their religious tradition, the hometown of Rosangela was in a cemetery in the same graveyard. The cemetery was called Riachao das Neves. So the whole family buried 37 are all Rosangela in this cemetery. The body was placed in a wooden coffin. The nails are hit by the coffin so that the coffin's lid can be closed. Totally, everything is done. You must have seen many times when someone dies in the hospital. There is a rule to put cotton in the nose and ears of the dead person. After putting it in the coffin, the grave was taken to the graveyard. A grave was already prepared. The coffin was removed from the grave and put it closed. The grave was covered with the stones, which was too heavy. And below these stones, the grave is now buried in a coffin. That was closed and properly packed from all the sides because it has been pierced. Finally, people burying them in the graveyard and putting all the stones on the ground. The whole family returned. After returning, some relatives who did not reach on time reached in the next 2 days and went and offered flowers on the grave. There was a whole settlement around this graveyard, and there were many families there. But after January 29th, nothing like that happened. A few days passed. The relatives who had not reached stopped. And then gradually, this process also stopped. Now, instead of this, some other things has started, where the population near this Riachao das Neves graveyard, especially at night, heard some woman screaming. It felt like the woman was asking for help. Some thought it must be a delusion. But the noise increases day by day from one house to many. Next day, the same happens during the day, even in the morning and in the afternoon. Things become hard to understand for everyone, but they get that it was coming from the graveyard. The voice is coming from the graveyard. Now it is just decided, but where is it coming from? No one knows. During this time, 2-3 days pass, and this voice stops. The topic made palupa in the society. Many people started talking about it, that from this graveyard, souls are started coming outside. But no one has the courage to check. They decided to have a loot over there. They found nothing but understood that there's something wrong with this graveyard. Gradually, the time passed. It had been 5-6 days more since Rosangela's funeral. Then the sound started coming again. The villagers are now worried. They started to search the graveyard during the day. Now they reached where they feel from where the sound coming out. Now there is a name and all the other identity written on every grave, according to tradition. Who are the parents of the child? Whose child? Whose wife? Date of the death. All these things are written. So they also thought that the voice was coming from here, but there might be some kind of misunderstanding. In a grave, they also knew that, according to the date, it had been buried for more than a week. How could anyone speak? There was a lot of misunderstanding in their minds. Who knows? There might be a soul or something else, but the voice didn't stop coming. Now it's been 9 days. The voice is coming in the same way, and it feels like someone is asking for help. After 10 days, people went to the graveyard again. There were hundreds of graves in that graveyard. The graveyard workers who used to complain to them also checked. There was no sound, but coincidentally, when he went near the grave, he heard a voice. He listened carefully and heard it. He was sure that the voice was coming from his grave. Then he thought that something might be happening. He went back. The grave is of Rosangela. She was buried in that grave. They found that in the morning she is the one who started screaming from the grave, "Help," like this, in her local language. Since people were worried about the settlement for so long, now they are convinced that this is the sound of Rosangela's voice. They have asked many people to inform their family members about the burial sites by the help of the details of the deceased family and address. Then the management committee of the graveyard will inform the family members that the sound is coming from a grave, belongs to them. Then people talk about many of them were involved in her last journey. They saw her in the coffin. And how does the doctors gave her death certificate? How could her voice have heard? But they thought maybe it was a miracle. They informed Rosangela's family. They reached. After the arrival of the family, they noticed everything. The noise that has not stopped. The people of the settlement, everything. Then the family's consent was to dug this grave immediately. And let's see what the matter is. Now the family is ready. The management committee of the graveyard is ready, and the people of the settlement are ready. So, the digging of the grave began. The stone was broken and removed. The grave was dug. Now the coffin was inside. Nothing fit. The coffin was taken out. When the grave was opened and the stones were removed, the first thing people saw and were shocked by the way the coffin was kept inside the grave. As the coffin was already moved away from its place by itself, it was like a valley. When the coffin is placed straight, how is this possible? The person who placed it very well so that it couldn't move. Now, how is this coffin a little crooked? Anyway, people who were scared took the coffin out of the grave. The nails were removed. The lid was opened. At the time the door opened, people started screaming inside. Why? Because Rosangela was alive. She was breathing, and her whole body was warm. People were wondering what that sound was, and someone was making a video. They were asking for an ambulance. People were touching her feet, and it was feet were hot. The sound of her breath was coming from her feet. How is it possible that there is no air, oxygen, a coffin, or slabs of stone, and everything is alive inside? So an ambulance was called, and they took Rosangela out of the coffin. When they were taken out and saw the coffin, people were shocked again. There were many bloodstains in the coffin, and it was said that both hands were wounded. There was many cuts and blood on them. Before burying the woman, there were no such things on her hands or face, because cause of death was heart attack where internal organs stopped working. So there's no meaning to blood. There was no post-mortem. And the blood of the dead people does not count like this. Now, according to all the wounds and cuts, it seems like she tried to get out of the coffin. There were tears in her ears. So all these things were indicating that she was not dead. But how? Because she was dead when she was buried, as the doctors himself declared her dead. Also, she was buried after 15 to 16 hours. Anyway, the ambulance came and took her to the hospital. She was in pain and very bad condition. After taking her to the hospital, the doctors saw her. They started treating her. It was on February 9. Now it's the 10th of February. One day she was in the hospital. On February 10, the doctors checked her again. Her heart was stopped. She was not breathing. Her pulse was quiet. In 12 days, the doctors declared him dead for the second time. Since an accident had happened, and the doctors knew that there was no doubt that her body was warm, the condition of the body, blood stains. So this was a genetic proof that she was alive inside the coffin. Again, when the doctors again checked him on February 12th and 11th, he was taken out of the grave. The night of the 11th, he stayed in the hospital. And on the 12th, the doctors checked him, and she was dead. This time, the doctors checked twice to see if she was alive, insured from all sides. Is she really dead? After 12 days, when the doctors and her family confirmed, Rosangela was taken back to the same place with the same religious tradition and buried in a new coffin, and the grave was dug a day before, and the body was taken out of it and buried again. Then the same stones and other things were written on it. So this is probably the only case where a burial is done. It is taken out after 11 months, and after 24 hours, it is buried again in the same grave. But the story does not end here. Now, the question was that all this evidence was proving that the Rosangela had been alive for 11 days. She was screaming from inside the coffin, which dozens have heard. She was asking for help to get someone out. No one's voice was reaching her. If she had heard her scream at the right time and had dug the grave in a couple of days, then who knows? Her condition would not have been so bad and she would have been alive. So the question is, where did this mistake come from? When all this happened, Rosangela's mother wrote a complaint to the police. She said that her daughter was alive, but the hospital and doctors declared her dead. And this is the carelessness of the hospital and doctors. That's why this case was investigated. Now the case has reached to the police, where the police said that we would investigate. All the family and the opinion of the doctors is being taken. And the Northeast Brazilian police say that if needed, we will once again dig the grave of Rosangela and take her body out. We will also take the medical board. So my friends, this was a strange story that came from Brazil.